It's my distinct pleasure. I think it's very fitting, as Mark pointed out on the strategic plan, that our purpose is to power the research that transforms agriculture. And when we engaged Ted Bilyea to participate in this, and on the agenda you would see the title, "The Future of Agriculture." Ted has the ability to discuss things on a global basis. I've known Ted now for, I would say, 10 to 12 years, one of the most impressive individuals that I've had the opportunity to work with. There are many on this call who know Ted and his capabilities, but for those of you who don't, I'll make a brief introduction. Ted resides in Toronto, and don't hold that against him because he's as much a Westerner. He has spent as much time in Alberta. He knows the Alberta landscape. He's traveled this province from stem to stern. He's here often and has been here often. He's been stymied now. This is the third time he was going to come and join us in person. He just told me that normally Ted likes to walk down the street to his local Starbucks, but there's over 2 feet of snow. Is that right, Ted?
Oh yeah, there's more than 2 feet, yeah.
And it'll be wet snow. We can use the moisture out here. But when I said that Ted is the Wayne Gretzky of agriculture, foresight and strategy, he knows where the puck is going to be. And a bit of his background, of course, he has most recently been Chair and Chief Strategy Officer for the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. That institute does great work. And one of the board members is Kim McConnell, who I think is on this call as well. Previously, a leading executive with Maple Leaf Foods. He's been an advisor on the ag side to Rabobank. Currently a board member of Patterson Grains, or Patterson Global Food. He was a director on the Alberta Livestock and Meat Agency with me for many years. He's an inductee into the Canadian Agricultural Hall of Fame, and just has a voracious appetite for looking at data, looking at trends, and determining how to solve problems. So with that, we have had input from many people with many questions, Ted, to start with. We have an hour, perhaps more. I mean, people can drop off when they want to, but this is a great learning opportunity, or an opportunity to get your perspective, and a perspective that sometimes you think, why didn't I think of that? So let's start with the first question. And we do have media folks on here, Ted, as you know. I hope we can get some good write-ups on some perspectives, or you can get some interviews to advance your ideas. But here's the first question. How do you advance the case for having ruminants, and more specifically, producing beef, when we are faced with the headwinds of the various environmental groups stating that methane production is an existential risk to our world? This may appear to be an extreme statement, but these folks get the media attention, and the average citizen buys in. So, what other major misconceptions do you see that need to be addressed for the future of Canada agriculture?
Well, let's start, David, with a bit of what I think, and I could be wrong, but I from what I've been reading, I think is a bit of it good news, and that is that I think the tide is beginning to turn a little bit. I'd be very interested to hear what others think about that. But there's been a number of voices that are beginning to bring the science forward in ways that people can understand better. And this is going to make it much more difficult, I think, for the committed livestock people, particularly the ones committed to putting us out of business in terms of cattle, because the science is not supporting them the way it was. There's two or three main threads to that, but the one that I think is that's the most difficult for them is that if you look at the total global cattle numbers over fairly long period of time here now, they haven't changed much. They go up and down a little bit, around essentially around 1 billion. But you would think if they're the main cause of the methane being jacked up, that you would see much larger cattle numbers globally. And but give or take 100 million of the billion, I mean, these numbers haven't changed much in a long time. And so that's kind of the science piece. But there's been a number of people coming at this very good stuff. And I think everybody on the call pretty much knows or has read or heard of Frank Mittler's work, at UC Davis. And I really think he's been able to pull the threads together of a number of researchers, particularly in North America, because you're tending to get better stuff out of North America than out of Europe. There's a fundamental issue with the Europeans is that they actually don't understand grassland. They think grassland's a pasture, and so a lot of their work tends to be distorted in a way. But the key for me is that, or the way I would define it is that Frank's been able to show us that it's really, when you look at methane as a system, a cycle like everything else, you have to have cattle numbers change to make a difference. The fact is that what's missing is it's not that there's too many cattle. There's too many cattle perhaps in the wrong place. That's one piece, because we haven't been able to make a proper distinction, or as good a distinction in people's minds, that when you're deforesting parts of the Cerrado and the Amazon, that's a very different calculation than when you're putting cattle on natural grassland, which gives off moisture, which essentially ultimately converts the methane in the air to other chemicals, which are far less harmful. So I think we're getting somewhere with that. What we aren't doing well, I think, is we're beginning to learn. We're beginning to learn how to do it, but we're still a ways away from perfection. Is how do we get in the key influencers involved in this discussion? How do we get that information to them? So the world is really driven by people of influence in the media, and we have some good stuff on our own thing. The Guardians of the Grassland for me was a really impressive discussion. They'd only got 15. I think I could be wrong in this, but I looked it up on, when I was thinking about some of this stuff about grasslands, and it seems to have about 15,000 views, and on YouTube. But it's a wonderful piece, and the question is, how do you add 2 more zeros to that? You need 1.5 million views to begin to drive things. There's another one that, if you haven't seen it, many of your people I'm sure have, but there's a chap in Saskatchewan which has a nice YouTube handle called Quick Dick McDick, and if you haven't seen his beefing around one, I mean, that takes Mittler's work and puts it in the most humorous way possible that everybody can understand, and he's got 60,000 views on his YouTube thing. And so the question is, how can we get 2 more zeros onto his, and then you'd be really making some progress. So the targets we have to go after, we're seeing some good work coming through the major science journals now. They were entirely different, 2 years ago, but they're beginning to support this. But I think we need to get to, there's 2 media sources that get quoted the most. One is The Guardian in the UK, which runs stories on this all the time, and they tend to have that leaning towards the European view. And the other one is the New York Times, which gets retreaded and requoted, sometimes cursed at. But the reality is, those are the kinds of, that's where we need to make the progress, because I think the science is on our side, that if you have grasslands, you need cattle on them, they're a system. And ultimately, the more work we can do on reducing methane or cattle that aren't on grass, that's the issue, the better. But the cattle on grass, as long as you got enough grassland, you got no problems. Our problem is not cattle, but shrinking grassland. And that's where we should be putting our focus.
And we might get to that later. Additionally, I think I've heard you say we can't allow journalists and others to talk about averages, global averages, because there are regional differences, right? We've got advantage on our feed efficiency and all sorts of things. So I'd like you to comment on that. And the second thing is, the basis of a lot of these things that are referred to is a flawed report out of California some years ago, and also a UN report. I mean, how do we get journalists and others to quit referring to that work, which is no longer credible?
That has been a real problem, ever since the Long Shadow report. The reality is that people aren't doing their homework. That's the reality. And the other side of this coin is, David, as you said, we get hung with the averages, and they're crazy. In no sense should we be allowing that. I'm surprised that people get away with saying that still. But in the other side of this coin, which is probably more important, is that we're going to run out of food long before we fry here. That's the reality. I've been looking specifically for a CAPI purpose at the net food flows. So in other words, people import and export and they produce, but there's two groups in the world really. There's the net food exporters. So those people are surplus in a net sense. Canada is one of seven major countries that are surplus, and that little group of seven makes up somewhere between around 45% of all the surplus food traded in the world. And then there's the other group, and there's five countries that make up about 50% of all the net deficit food flows in the world. And the reality is Canada is a very low GHG, highly efficient producer. All this talk tends to take us off the game, which is we should be absolutely focused, and the world should want us absolutely focused on producing enough food to stay in that group, along with other countries you can probably guess. The big boy at the moment is Brazil, but some questions about some of the stuff they're producing: the U.S., Australia, Argentina, Canada, and tacked on the end, and New Zealand is another one, and tacked on the end of that is India. And the one thing I worry about is India is in transition from those seven significant surplus food exporters to a deficit net importer. When that happens, there isn't enough food to make it work, particularly with some of the policy issues that are being advanced today, which is going to make sure there isn't enough. I mean, we can get into that maybe later, but it's absolutely clear on one of the big ones, which affects canola and soybeans. I think most people in the audience probably have figured out what that is, but that you can't turn food into fuel when you have essentially a balance in the world where our stock use ratios are actually declining. So nobody can make sense out of that one. It leads you to a good place actually for RDAR, a good place for Alberta in the long run, but a really bad place for a lot of the world.
Well, we've got so many questions, and Steve has one there about our federal government and how we're facing headwinds for the advancement of agriculture. We'll get that later. I'm going to ask one more question, and then Lydia has a number of questions that are coming in. I've got some others, but let's go with another one, Ted. Which countries are doing value-added food processing right? And what is the main change you would like to see at the industry level and at the policy level to help Alberta's industry reach a higher global standing in food processing? And of course, I know you know a lot about the Netherlands. You were with Rabobank. Where can or should Alberta lead the way when it comes to investments in ag and ag research? Big question again.
Yeah, big question. So, okay, let's get the common theme out of the way first, because everybody tends to answer that question by pointing at the Netherlands. And I'll just say a couple of things about that, and then I want to focus more on the second part of your question. So the Netherlands has done a lot of things right, for sure. But one of the most important things I think they did was to realize that they don't have a lot of land. And you better make damn good use of it, what you got, because it's not a very big place. And so one of the things they did was they invested very heavily in horticulture. And they were smart enough to figure out that they needed to they needed a couple of things. One was they as the horticulture in the Netherlands began to become greenhouse developments, they really became the world's IP center for greenhouse. How do you make horticulture work in greenhouses? So if you're investing in greenhouses in Canada, you're probably using Dutch technology. And then they did another thing. They are also big seed genetics people. So they poured a lot of effort into the genetics side. So they surrounded the industry with smart science. And then finally, they had a banking community that was really favorable to agriculture. And Rabo was one of those. They in fact bank more agriculture in the world than anybody else. And but it came from that mix of IP and fundamentally an identification of what's the real issue. I like to take that story and twist it a little bit, because really what it's telling you is ultimately your first decision is the most important one. And that is to make sure whatever you're going to develop, whatever you're going to add value to, that you have a fundamental competitive advantage. I see all kinds of people adding value to stuff where I don't understand what the competitive advantage is, then anybody else can do it. So maybe, one of the, a little story close to home for Alberta was the story of how we got involved in the Lethbridge pork plant. And why that.
When you say we, clarify that was.
Canada Packers had made an acquisition in Alberta that involved taking over a beef plant in Lethbridge at the time. And Canada Packers those days, or Maple Leaf, was stepping away from the beef business and concentrating on pork and poultry. And they were actually just going to disband this plant, not use it. And but I've been doing a lot of business in Japan, and we've been at those days we were exporting frozen pork to Japan, and but I was very aware of how the Japanese developed chilled pork, or in those days they called fresh pork in Japan, because I'd visited many of their plants, and and when we were getting rid of this, at the time I was involved deeply in working with. In the US with Hormel. We were exporting Hormel's frozen pork at that time. We had managed to have, by the luck of it, a very, very hot summer in the late 80s. And the Hormel people were doing something very unusual. They were taking a loin, and they were chilling it in ice, cutting it in half because they had no cryovac bags that would fit it, and and then sending it on its way. And it was going to New York City. And the reason they were doing that, as it turned out, when I was down there inquiring, why are you destroying these loins? They said, because our claims coming in from New York City because of the hot summer are so bad that we have to do something. We need to add shelf life. They were getting shelf life around 10 days, but it's a long way from the Midwest to New York City in those days to distribute the pork in 10 days. And they were getting these claims. I said, how much more shelf life are you getting by putting it in ice? And the answer that came back was, we're getting about a week more. Well, it didn't take much arithmetic to figure out if you could get, be up to 21 days on that, you could ship it to Japan. And the only people supplying Japan in those days was Taiwan. So how does this get back to Alberta? Well, we successfully developed the first chilled pork shipments from North America to Japan out of the Hormel plant by putting a team of people in there. And at that point, when all this was occurring, we had a real interest in doing something in Canada at some point. So we were changing this beef plant over to a pork plant, and I said, why don't we build it from the beginning as a Japanese plant, and we'll send chilled Japanese pork. It was extremely difficult to get anybody in Canada Packers to agree to that, because the reality was, I said, frozen works fine. Why do you want to do that? But at the very end of it, there was two things that stood out to me. There was a strong competitive advantage. First off, what's the competitive advantage for North America itself in both in hogs and in cattle? It's really simple. It's a mathematic rule. You cannot move grain and grass to large animals. You have to move the animals to the grass. So fundamentally, we had the competitive advantage. All the world that doesn't believe that produces lots of meat, they do that because of high subsidies and high protectionism. And we didn't need either one. So that was the first point. The second one was that you can see the difference in the meat if you feed them the right feed. And so what that right feed was barley. So if you feed hogs barley, the fat's whiter, and the meat looks, when contrasted to the fat, looks totally different. So we had a built-in competitive advantage on two layers when we started there, and then the third layer of advantage that was it became a competitive advantage was we decided not to run the slaughter end of the plant the way we do in Canada, but run it like we do in Japan. And the key to that was, there's two issues there. One was that you wind up being able to chill that pork very rapidly, because essentially you take the skin off just like you do cattle. And without that big overcoat on, the meat chills down much quicker, and at far less energy required to chill it, and you get a higher quality meat out of that. So that became it was a clear competitive advantage, and everything we did to differentiate on top of that was additional work. So that has worked, David, very well. That plant is still, I believe, the single most profitable per unit pork plant in North America, it tells you that the core to this thing is to differentiate, but to understand fundamentally what your competitive advantages are, and I think, and you can expand that to any of those businesses as you add value.
Okay, yeah, competitive advantage. You did mention yesterday when we were talking that people forget that one of Holland's competitive advantages is they can import raw product, process it, and send it out, and they've got 300 million consumers within the EU.
500.
We've got the US, but that's a difference too.
They have a very protected market relative to what we have with the US. It's very difficult, as we've found, to get access. Even when we have a trade agreement with the EU, it's very difficult to actually ship the product there. And that's another story for another day. We know why that's the case. But so they have that protected market, but they also had one of the largest and most efficient ports in Europe, and they had the limited agricultural mass of their own, except what they were adding high value to. So they realized their point of difference there. What they could add value to was they could add value to anything in the world that would come into them cheaply through a beautiful port, and then run it into Europe where it's well protected. So they became excellent at in their. They do pork, they do poultry, they do particularly well with vegetable oils and adding value and dairy, and you can name it. All those things that they bring in and then they add value to.
Good. Lydia, I'll defer to you. Have you picked a great question for Ted, please?
Absolutely. And I thank you to those who are asking questions and commenting on it. So I've got two questions here and they're a little related. So I'm going to combine them. And fundamentally, they're about food security, food affordability, and inflation and around the cost of production. At the same time, we're looking at there's increasing climate change, climate disasters. We're looking into researching increased efficiency that can only go so far when we're talking about our supply chain and different factors playing in. So the question is really around your thoughts around all of these complicating issues around food security, affordability, cost of production, and so on.
Well, let's try to unpack it a little bit. The food security issue is for real. And I would also say it's an issue that, and I'm going to start by talking at the global level first, then I'll come down to the Canadian level of it. But at the global level, there's no doubt in my mind that unless we have a major technology change in how we produce food where we don't need land, then we are going to have, in the not too distant future, a significant food security problem. It's beginning to unfold in front of our eyes, and it will continue, I think, to be pretty difficult, regardless of whether we have good crops in North America next year or not. We'll need two bumper years to make any difference at all, and we'll need a great crop out of South America too. So there is a global food security issue for sure. As I mentioned, some countries are becoming extremely dependent. I wish I had charts to go through this with you because it would be much easier. But one of the things that has caught my attention over the time is how much of the world's food is now supplied by trade as opposed to being grown locally. 20 years ago, it was a fairly small number. It was something around about 12%. It's a big number now. It's getting closer to 20, up in that high teens. That's supplied globally, and that's very fragile. And anything can go wrong on that. And as I said, there are very few net exporters that are supplying most of it. So you have a big concentration issue. But if you take it down a notch to food security in Canada, that's a very different kettle of fish. We did a CAPI study on this a while back, and I remember when we were writing it, we said, why don't we just call it the 3 A's? There's 3 A's here. There's availability, accessibility, and affordability. Now, which of those apply? Well, it's pretty hard to argue that there's some availability problem in Canada. When we look at at what we're doing today, 70% of what we consume in Canada in terms of food is produced in Canada, and yet we still export 50% of what we produce. So we are wildly surplus, in the things. Now, if from a preference basis, maybe you wouldn't be able to get everything you need, or you not. I shouldn't say need, want, or you might have to pay through the nose to get it, but you're not going to starve to death if we can convert that in food. The only availability issue that we have in Canada you can really put your finger on is that we tend to if you believe your food security is about processed foods, then we do have an issue because we are by far the largest processed food importer in percentage. We're the U.S.'s massive customer for processed foods. The stuff that we send down there raw and bring back here, we're massive, and that we're bigger than in the high value added consumer foods than Japan, Korea, China, and Hong Kong put together for the U.S. Just to give you a little idea of how important that is to them. So we do have that issue. But that's pretty fertile ground, because it allows, that means that, when we finally figure out what our competitive advantages are, we could build on that a little bit to do import replacement. But we don't have to worry too much about that, because there's plenty of the rest of the world that we can ship to, and we're already consuming a fair bit of our own. But when you get to the second piece of that, the accessibility issue, we do have a problem in Canada. There are parts of Canada that have accessibility problems. Certainly our native communities in the north have a big accessibility problem, and we need to help them solve that problem. And those are going to be technology solutions. And David, they're probably going to involve better energy solutions for them than they have today, so they can grow some of this stuff themselves in the north. So accessibility is an issue, but it's an even bigger issue for a lot of the world. And COVID is putting it on the map for sure, with the issues that we were running into with the logistics, as you and I were chatting about at the beginning of this, is that the logistics issue is going to make accessibility incredibly more difficult. And we're not done with it yet, that's for sure. We're not, as we go through this, we may have another round of logistic nightmares coming as China begins to lock down, when they're trying to deal with the Omicron. In terms of affordability, we do have a problem. Affordability in Canada, but that is not, the key thing is that shouldn't be on the ag agenda. That belongs over on the social agenda, because that's about income. We can't solve affordability by essentially asking ag to solve that problem. And that's a problem that we need to push back hard on, because that's going to get us nowhere. So I think if you unpack that issue, it's a little easier, but I can't remember what the rest of the question was.
I think that covers all of it. Although I have a question that's going to ask you to put on your Wayne Gretzky crystal ball hat. Will trade and investment with China resume 3 years ago, or is that forever damaged?
Well, it's funny you say that. I have no concern about that's less of our problem and a hell of a lot more of China's problem, because
just before you carry on, Ted, tell the folks how involved you are in China and how often you go there, and you actually speak one of the dialects, so that's what Ted also brings to this. And I think you represent a company in Toronto. I'm not giving all your, you make so much money, I just have to ask you how many yachts you now have to water ski.
My yacht, as you know, my yacht's a canoe. So
up at the lake. Anyway, tell them a bit about your involvement in China and how China is one area, and Japan that Ted is an expert.
No, well, I guess I've been involved in those two markets for most of my working life. And my first visits to Asia, when it was so long ago that it still looked like Asia, before you had any high rises, you had one high rise building in Hong Kong the first time I went there. And when I went to China the first time, it was probably 1972, and I was sent over there to buy peanuts for Canada Packers to make peanut butter. And I had to go to the Canton Fair because you weren't allowed to go into mainland China. And at that point, they had the fair in Hong Kong, and that's where the Guailos, the people that were from foreigners, went to buy things. And so I've been at it since then, and I've had a long history of it with Maple Leaf Foods. But the thing I think is pretty clear, David, is that China is coming to the conclusion. Certainly, most of the well-educated leaders in China are knowledgeable about the fact that they cannot feed themselves. I think I think that's the one thing that probably we aren't fully aware of or understand, but they're getting the picture pretty clearly, and they know that their own projections are very aggressive and probably unlikely to be met, even unless everything went perfect, and things aren't going perfect. So I think that we'll find there's more opportunity to work with China in the future if we can get through this nasty period that we're in now, where geopolitical strategies are beginning to push aside some things that are absolutely necessary. One of those things is you have to be able to eat, and so I think we will see saner heads prevail eventually here on this. But in the meantime, I mean, we're not lacking in places to go with our product. As I said, you don't see any, we see lower stocks in Canada and lower stock use ratios globally than we've seen in what, since 2000 and I don't know, probably the early 2000s, when we had the Great Grain Robbery. The 1970s, not 2000. My brain's gone. 1973, since we had the Great Grain Robbery, and so we got a lot of digging out to do. So I think the ball's in China's court a bit, because we're not lacking in places to go with the product. Sure, we'd like to supply China because they can pay more for it than others can, and we've got no reason not to. But it's kind of their choice. They're going to have to figure out how they're going to feed themselves.
Lydia, I'll just jump in with a question here. So all investors in innovation face the challenge of balancing funding of current sector research with new areas and opportunities. And this afternoon, we saw in RDAR's strategic framework an emphasis on balancing a portfolio of research projects. What advice would you give RDAR and its members and the group that are involved here to balance the portfolio between current industry innovation and the new sectors, technologies, and products?
Well, when I'm looking at the presentation there that we had for Mark Davis, one thing that was going through my mind was that RDAR is doing some fabulous work, very, very targeted at what I think is very important, which is productivity. So 3 of those 4 pieces of his chart really nailed productivity in different ways. So that you were doing all kinds of good things to, for yields, for health of animals, for crop health, for soil health, sustainability. Those are wonderful things because they're boosting productivity. And God knows we need productivity boost because we are in a multi-year slide in terms of global agricultural productivity decline. The productivity's got to increase about 1.8% to 2% a year in order to keep feeding everybody, particularly if incomes rise and people decide to up their interest in protein. Then that has to carry on. We are not getting that out of productivity increases anymore, despite wonderful things happening on the genetics front. We're not getting it. And why aren't we getting it? Primarily because of climate change. Primarily because Mother Nature's not giving us the same respect that she used to. And at the same time as that is overall agricultural funding has been falling in the developed world. So we have a productivity problem, and I do see RDAR as doing the right thing in pushing that forward. However, having said that, that's only half of business, right? Business is made up of 2 things: revenue and cost. And the productivity gains are all driven primarily at not keeping your costs under control, for the amount of output you have. That's not bringing you new innovation in the sense of new product. And so what I'm a little bit concerned about is I don't see a lot of that happening anywhere. It's not an RDAR thing, but it's that, when you think about that, and given the fact that you are you're an agricultural organization that is trying to bring productivity back to the farm level, it's unlikely that ideas that are going to be disruptive and certainly new business ideas tend to be quite disruptive whatever is in place already, particularly if you're in a business as all agriculture is, where your fixed asset is so high relative to, your other assets. Most businesses, the fixed capital is small, is not as large as the rest of your capital budget. Agriculture it is, so you're going to be far more cautious about wanting to disrupt that. And what I think would be useful at some point is to have a piece of the portfolio, and I really like the idea that RDAR has a portfolio management strategy. And don't get me wrong, if you didn't do this, it wouldn't hurt RDAR or wouldn't hurt Alberta. But I think you could do a little more by figuring out, okay, so what is that new driver? What's going to happen? Where's the next thing like chilled pork going to come from? Chilled pork would never have arisen under those circumstances. In fact, you would have had all the problems that I had trying to convince the old management of Canada Packers to even invest in the thing in their first plant, because they had a plant in Toronto and they refused to turn it over because they said no, that's going to screw up our business. We're in the frozen pork business, and the only reason we got away, the only reason anything happened was we had a new owner shortly after when I was doing the Hormel business. Otherwise, no chilled pork, and that chilled pork is what has driven the pork business in Canada for the last 30 years. And it was only the fact that the old management left, and when Wallace McCain came in, he the first thing he said to me, well, he yelled at me. He said, "Why are you doing so much business with our competitors?" Because in those days, the first business I was doing in Canada actually was with the Gainers plant in Edmonton, and the only reason Gainers accepted it was Barry Mayer. He had a big problem on his hands. Gainers had gone broke. The government owned the plant. The plant was going to have to be shut down. And one day he said to me, when we were having a cup of coffee down at our French fry plant, he said to me, I got this big problem. And I said, how would you like some new business for it? And he said, all you have to do is invest in it. You have to invest in machinery, which nobody else has. And you got to take a leap of faith. And lo and behold, he took the leap of faith, and we had a run rate of about $23 million of a profit within 6 months of deciding to do that. Plant eventually got shut down totally, but it brought chilled pork to the country, because Maple Leaf decided that they were making a lot of money in that plant. It was just the oldest plant in Canada at the time, pretty well, and you're going to go build a new one. So they went and built brand new.
Ted, I think I hear you say maybe take some more risks, go for a home run on something that's not proven. So we'll take that. A couple of our participants here, Graham Finn and Nicole Neubauer, are talking about food waste. And you said that 1 to 2% gain in food production is necessary. What's your view of how much food is wasted in the world, especially in developed countries, and how we might approach that in terms of that's consumers being lazy, I suspect, or consumers having too much money, or I'm not sure what it is. Just give us your comments on food waste for these two keeners that are writing in the chat box here.
Food waste reminds me very much of the other problem we just discussed when we talked about essentially food security. You've got to break that problem down to understand it. And so in your developed world, boy, there's a lot of food waste, and that food never gets to the marketplace to get wasted in the first place. It's a small percentage of the food actually makes it to the market. So much of it is rotting in the fields and the transport, and it's of no value when it gets to somewhere. It's diseased, etc. So they have a huge food waste problem that is killing them. And those are things that could all be dealt with essentially by with capital investment and with the investment in infrastructure and plants, and that is beginning to happen. But that's the biggest piece of it. The second biggest, as you're referring to, is in the developed world, particularly in North America. And that's the waste that occurs between, from essentially supermarket through consumer. In some cases, actually, to some degree, it can occur in the distribution system itself. But the big piece is, in the consumer side. And I think, besides, kind of shaking our finger at consumers and things like that, I think the big thing to do is to ask ourselves, so let's assume we aren't able to train everybody to be better cooks and make sure they clean out their fridge regularly. I think that's kind of barking up the wrong tree, frankly. I think the big issue is we should never think of anything that's going in the green box as food waste. That's somebody's input to other types of business. And you've got, I'm sure, people on the call that could tell you all kinds of things you could do with that. But that's input to somebody else's business in terms of upcycling it. And particularly, I mean, God help you if you're worried about meat being wasted like that, because right now, a friend of mine in the meat business that makes the oils out of it, his biggest problem is competing with the people that want the stuff for biodiesel, and he can't get enough. He runs a food. He runs a food business out of the good cuts that come out of a plant when they have fat left over and stuff like that. He can't get enough of it anymore because he can't pay as much for the food use for the lard and the tallow as the biodiesel people can for burning it. So be careful of what you define as waste, and because that's somebody's input you're talking about that needs that. It's all types of fats and calories that are energy in some other form.
Okay, Lydia, next to you for a question, and we're going to try and shut this down at about the hour mark, or 3:35, 3:40. So we've got a bit of time. Lydia?
Certainly. So one of the questions that we've got coming in, that we're talking about, the CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs is a demographer, about declining global population because of birth rates are below replacement. What are your thoughts?
Well, first off, I've looked at 3 different analyses of that lately for a different purpose. And if you're looking out towards the end of the century, maybe then that becomes an issue. If you're looking at specific countries, there's clearly no growth in the developed world, but it's not as rapidly declining as people think, other than Japan and maybe some parts of Eastern Europe. The big decline is in China, and that is a slowing. We're not quite at the completely at the worst part of the curve yet, but we can say for this year, certainly the labor force for the first time in China is shrinking, and so they're right on that part of it. On the other part, looking at Africa and the Middle East, there isn't any decline that's visible on any of the charts that I've seen so far, other than what is very, very recent that we've seen as maybe COVID has had an impact. We'll know that in a couple of years. But so you're still going to get growth. It's just not going to be the kind of growth that we've seen historically. And yes, you will get decline. But I mean, are you going to plan your business around a decline that we're going to get 20 years hence, or are you going to plan your business around the fact that we're flattening out, but having lots of growth still in Africa? Every chart I've looked at says the minimum we're going to add in Africa and the Middle East is about 2 billion people. You'll lose some of that in the rest of the world for sure, but it still means growth. It doesn't mean decline in the next 20 years. Beyond that, anybody's game. So I would be careful about being cavalier with the numbers, because unless you've got better reports than what the UN just released, they're pushing that decline out. And yes, the decline, they're pushing it out some years. So I would tend to be looking at, how do you work with the population numbers more or less that we have today, But one factor, the most important factor, is not the population number for what we produce in Alberta, or shouldn't be. If it is, then we're in real trouble. But if it shouldn't be, it shouldn't be. It should be, what's the income level? Because income is what drives the stuff we want to sell, not population. You know, we're not massive sellers of stuff to Africa. We're looking to sell our stuff, you know, hopefully to the part of the world that can afford to buy quality. So we need to keep. I think we've got to be careful about how we use those ideas, because they can lead you off into a very different world. I think I'd be focused on, are we still looking at income growth? If we are looking at income growth, it means protein growth fundamentally, and vegetable oil growth fundamentally. You know, and yes, it will mean some high quality grain growth as well. So fruit and veg growth. I mean, you're going to get growth in the things that create a lot of income, and things that don't create a lot of income, maybe not. So I'd focus on income, not on the number of people.
Okay. This may be the last question, Ted, and we really thank you for being available, and we'll have more of these. Here's a question for you. A number of recent events, and we've touched on this briefly, but there's an addition to this. A number of recent events have highlighted the weaknesses in our food and commodity supply chains, affecting both producers and consumers. What can be done to mitigate supply chain risk in Alberta and Canada? And one proposed solution to supply chain disruption is small local packing and processing facilities. Economies of scale has not supported the feasibility of local meat processing in the past. Will the potential of another pandemic or other global disruption event be enough for consumers to support them? So that's a little bit on the smaller scale production. And then I'll put a tag on, which is big. I'd like you to comment on the importance of labor, or shortages of labor in our sector. And then that may be the end. You can go have a Starbucks.
Yeah, I'll need one. You may have to repeat the question as we go through it a bit, because there's a lot to that. Again, these are things that are terribly difficult to unpack. But
I'll put it simply. Producing food closer to local populations, and the fact that you don't have to go across borders or across countries to distribute it, thereby probably smaller processing, local packing or processing facilities. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
What's the feasibility of that, or is scale everything? And then the second piece is just comment a bit about labor.
Okay. I'll just, as I start that, I want to remind you again that, you know, 70% of what we consume in the way of food in Canada, we produce here. So it's not like we're not doing that. You know, to some, the question is, can we do more of it? And the answer is yes, perhaps. But remember that 50% of what we produce, we export. So unless you're going to bring more land into production, you know, you have to have some trade-off somewhere in that package. Cappy produced a paper on it, and so did there's been several papers produced on the issue of small plants, and do we need more of them? And the answer would we could always use more plants, providing you have more raw material for that. So in the Alberta case, I assume the people that want more plants are either intending for one of the big plants to leave, or they're intending for to simply come up with more land, because, you know, at the end of the day, you have to have animals to go through the plants, and so you've got to think about, do I have enough animals? Well, already we're starting to see, you know, significant numbers of cattle now coming into Alberta to get processed. That's not because there's a lack of. It's not. I mean, that one would think anyway. I'm sure some of the people on the line could explain this better. But when you've got cattle coming into Alberta to be processed, it suggests that you need more cattle in Alberta. and you're exporting cattle too, of course, at the same time. But that let's not think simply in terms of the plants. The second piece of that puzzle is that all those studies show that, of course, what we already know is that those smaller plants tend to be more costly in terms of unit cost to run. So the way the way small plants can work in that scenario is if they're highly differentiated. So the really small plants are fine because they can be local food industries. People can come up, you drive up to the farm, and you've got a country slaughter on the farm. Medium-sized plants can work very well, and you've got a good one. I heard you had one of the prices on the call. They run a great shop. Centera is in that medium-sized category, and I take my hats off to them all the time because they have figured out that chain. How to link their slaughter through to the retail, and in Japan, Ray was pretty smart. He lined it up with a customer that was the right size, that wanted his product at the right time. I don't know if they're still doing that, but it was a good move. So you can do a medium-sized plant, which is usually the toughest place to be. Really small is always okay because you're so differentiated locally. Really big works because your costs are much lower. The middle ground is harder unless you differentiate. And so he figured it out. One of the best stories I've ever seen, and I wish if anybody from Alberta visits Toronto and they want a tour, give me a call. I'll take them to what is easily the best butcher shops in Canada. At least they make the most money. And it's Cumbry. And you can go on the website and look up Cumbry Meats, and you'll see they have worked something out where they're an alliance between farmers who produce either chickens or pork or beef, and they produce it as part of that consortium for Cumbry. Cumbry runs these really fancy butcher shops, and the one thing that they have no interest in is competing on price. They couldn't care less. Their idea is whatever Loblaws is selling for, we'll make it way more expensive. And guess what? They get lineups at the door. And essentially then they subcontract out the slaughter, but they cut the stuff up in the store and in a very large stores, and they display the beef carcasses in the windows, which it really annoys the anti-beef movement. When you walk down Bayview Avenue, you can see in a beautiful glass window the carcasses hanging, and you can see the numbers on the establishment number, and you can go in and ask them, and they have a fair bit of traceability running. So they may not tell you which farm it came from, but they'll tell you which one of 3 or 4. So being able to differentiate at that level is the salvation for small operations, because they use provincially, as well as I think they do have contracts with one of the federal ones as well, federal suppliers, but for slaughter. So that's one way of going about it. But the key to that is the differentiation.
Okay. Well, we'll get into labor another time. I see there's a number of questions, and Lydia, you'll collated them. We'll keep all the questions and keep them for another time. I think we're at 3:35. Ted, you've been very generous with your time and your thoughts. On behalf of everyone at RDAR, and certainly the 150 people that were online, and we're now down to about 115. I really want to express my gratitude for your willingness to contribute. I know you're in our corner. I know that you're fighting for us, given the carbon taxes and the increased costs. You're in Ottawa often. You're close to the seat of power. We need to have influence on policy, and sensible policy. So keep up the good work with Cappy, and thank you for your time. Do you have any parting comments for the producers of Alberta?
No, I think that it's a good place to be right now, and I would just say that have the courage to keep investing in what you're doing, and I think RDAR could be a phenomenal resource to do that. let's focus very much on doing something that's a lot harder for other people to copy. And if you can do something that starts on the farm where most of the hard to copy stuff goes, and you find a willing processor that's going to carry that through, that becomes really difficult for a big organization to come along and copy, because they've got to copy both what's processing, and they can do that, but then they have to copy the farm model, and they won't want to do that. So that that's when things get really good.
Good. Well, great advice. Thank you very much. Stay warm.
Thank you. I got to go dig out my driveway.
Good. And anybody that wants to communicate to us, here's our contact information. The RDAR website, of course, and that's still undergoing improvements and change. And we've got the email. So thank you very much for joining us. Bye for now.